I think there were not many people who understood just how broad his interests were and how supportive he was of an astonishingly wide range of organisation.
The decision was supposed to be routine. King Charles had arrived prepared to place Camilla inside one of the monarchy's most influential charitable structures, believing his authority would carry the appointment through without resistance. But before the declaration could become official, Princess Anne intervened. Calmly, publicly enough to matter, and with one devastating objection: the king could not name Camilla a Royal Foundation trustee without the council vote required to approve her. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles froze. He had expected agreement, not resistance, from his own sister. The Royal Foundation, a charitable organization connected to senior royals and created to support long-term public causes, carried more than symbolic weight. A trustee could shape priorities, influence governance discussions, and become part of decisions tied to the monarchy's future public work. That was why Anne believed the process mattered. Camilla did not speak. She sat rigidly as the silence grew heavier, watching the king absorb what had happened. Her embarrassment was immediate because the objection did not attack her charitable record. It attacked the way the role was being handed to her. Charles had wanted the appointment treated as settled. Anne had turned it into a question of legitimacy. Anne reached into the folder beside her and placed a marked council file on the table. The council vote, a formal decision taken by the governing group responsible for approving major foundation matters, could not simply be skipped, she said. Charles could support Camilla. He could argue for her. But he could not replace the council's authority with his own preference. Charles pulled the appointment paper closer. For several seconds, the king read the clause Anne had indicated without speaking. Then he looked at his sister, glanced toward Camilla, and slowly set the pen beside the unsigned page. The gesture changed everything. No announcement followed. The appointment had been stopped before the ink could dry. Camilla turned toward Charles, searching his face for reassurance, but he offered none. Anne had forced him into a position he never expected, defending not his wife's suitability, but his decision to bypass a vote, and that distinction cut deeply. Anne was not finished. Inside the same folder sat another record, suggesting this was not the first time a route around council approval had been considered for Camilla. Charles may have put down the pen, but Anne had forced everyone around that table to confront a more dangerous question. And nobody in that room could dismiss it anymore. Why was the vote being avoided in the first place? For outsiders, it looked like a dispute over procedure. Inside the family, it was anything but. Charles saw a wife he believed deserved institutional recognition. Camilla saw yet another moment when acceptance appeared within reach before being pulled away. Anne saw something more dangerous, a boundary being erased because nobody wanted to tell the king no. And suddenly, three people bound by family were divided by three completely different definitions of loyalty. Charles could not shake the humiliation of the halted meeting. To him, Camilla's proposed role inside the Royal Foundation felt like a natural extension of her growing public duties, a way of showing that the Queen Consort belonged fully inside the monarchy's charitable future. The foundation itself was a governed charitable body, meaning its major decisions were supposed to follow agreed rules rather than personal royal instruction. Anne understood that distinction clearly. For her, protecting those rules mattered because credibility disappeared the moment they changed according to who was asking. Charles found his sister beside a closed office door, before either of them had fully recovered from the confrontation. He asked whether she had deliberately chosen to embarrass his wife in front of everyone. Anne felt the accusation immediately, but she did not retreat. "Are you opposing Camilla?" the king demanded. "Or are you protecting the institution?" His sister held his gaze. "I am protecting the rule you will need others to respect when you are no longer the one benefiting from it." Camilla carried the wound differently. She sat alone later, with the unsigned appointment paper nearby, staring at the promise Charles had been unable to fulfill. Anger came first, then something quieter replaced it. She had spent years fighting for acceptance, and now another position that appeared settled had suddenly become uncertain. What hurt most was that the resistance had come from Anne, someone whose judgment carried unusual weight inside the family. Anne then gave Charles the detail that changed his anger into concern. Several council members had never been told that Camilla's appointment was coming. The council, the group responsible for formally approving major foundation decisions, would have discovered the change only after the king had already treated it as complete. That meant the issue was no longer simply whether his wife deserved the position. It was whether people had been intentionally left out of the decision. Charles began replaying every briefing he had received. Advisors had described the appointment as straightforward, almost routine. Now the monarch wondered whether important information had been withheld, or whether he had heard exactly what he wanted to hear and never pressed harder. Anne watched that realization settle over him before mentioning one final detail. Months earlier, at a private foundation reception, Camilla had asked a question that seemed harmless at the time. The Princess Royal had never forgotten it. With that warning, the dispute stopped being about one blocked appointment, because Anne was about to reveal the moment when she first realized something larger was taking shape. Months before Anne stopped Charles, there had been another room, another conversation, and another request that seemed almost harmless at the time. It happened after a private Royal Foundation reception, when most guests had already left and the evening was winding down. Camilla asked a senior administrator a simple question about trustee authority. Anne happened to hear the answer. What followed became the exact moment she would later remember as the point of no return. Camilla kept the question casual. She wanted to know whether trustees could influence appointments to specialist charitable committees without every senior royal being consulted. A trustee, in simple terms, is someone formally responsible for helping guide and oversee an organization. The administrator explained that the role carried real strategic influence, but not personal freedom to act without limits. Important decisions still depended on governance procedures, shared approval, and collective responsibility. Anne listened without interrupting. What unsettled her was not the first question, but the second. Camilla pressed for clarification about how much authority one trustee could exercise independently, once already inside the structure. The Princess Royal heard the administrator explain again that influence was substantial, but never absolute. She said nothing then. She simply remembered every word. Camilla noticed the tension later, when Anne made a restrained remark about charitable institutions never becoming extensions of palace hierarchy. The queen consort understood the implication immediately. She replied that nobody had suggested otherwise, but the warmth had disappeared from her voice. Anne answered just as politely. The exchange lasted only moments, yet both women left it knowing something had shifted. Anne's unease deepened weeks later. Through a documented foundation briefing circulated among senior advisors, she learned that informal discussions had begun about giving Camilla a permanent role. Suddenly, the questions from that reception no longer felt theoretical. They felt connected. The Princess Royal began examining how the appointment was being described and who was expected to approve it. Anne then found the detail she could not ignore. A draft governance note, an internal paper explaining how major foundation decisions should be handled, described Camilla's appointment as requiring royal approval. But the document said nothing about the council vote Anne believed was necessary. Earlier paperwork had clearly referred to collective trustee approval. Now that language was gone. Anne sat alone after reviewing the papers again. She removed her glasses, reread the administrator's original briefing note, and drew one firm line beneath the words describing collective approval. Then she folded the page carefully and placed it inside her personal correspondence case. She kept it for months. The confrontation that later stopped Charles was never spontaneous. Anne had been preparing since that night, and when the king finally demanded an explanation, years of sibling loyalty were about to collide with the one boundary she refused to surrender. There were no raised voices at first. That made the confrontation more dangerous. Charles stood behind his chair, Camilla beside him, while Anne remained seated with the council papers open before her. The king asked whether his sister truly intended to obstruct him over a technicality. Anne looked directly at him and delivered the sentence nobody else in the room had been willing to say. This was not a technicality. It was authority without consent. Charles pushed back immediately. Camilla had spent years carrying out charitable work, supporting public causes, and standing beside the sovereign through difficult periods. To him, that made her an obvious candidate. The council, the governing group responsible for formally approving major foundation decisions, would almost certainly support her anyway, he argued. Why create a confrontation over a result everyone already expected? Anne refused to accept that logic. She told him that expected approval was not actual approval. A vote only meant something if it could genuinely be taken. Remove that step, because the outcome looked predictable, and the process became meaningless. The Princess Royal did not question Camilla's experience. She questioned the assumption that royal preference could stand in place of consent. Charles felt the challenge becoming personal. He accused his sister of turning a family disagreement into something resembling a constitutional battle, a confrontation over who had the right to exercise authority. Anne did not flinch. She answered that he had created that problem himself the moment he tried to replace procedure with certainty. Camilla finally broke her silence through the private conversation unfolding at that table. She asked Anne whether the objection would have been this fierce if another royal had been nominated. The queen consort's frustration was clear. Anne answered without hesitation. She would have stopped anyone appointed that way, she said, even herself. Anne then reached for the document she had kept since the reception months earlier. She placed the earlier draft beside the newer papers and showed Charles how references to council approval had gradually disappeared. The king stopped arguing. Charles pushed his chair backward and pulled the drafts toward him. He laid them side by side, reading each version carefully. The missing sentence was impossible to ignore. Camilla reached toward him, but he raised one hand because he suddenly needed silence. Charles's anger changed direction. He demanded to know who had altered the wording. One advisor finally acknowledged, in that closed-door exchange, that the language had been changed after discussions with the king's private office, the small team that handles the monarch's official work and instructions. Anne had won the argument over procedure. But the papers now pointed toward something more uncomfortable. Who truly controlled royal power once the king's wishes began moving through the machinery around him? The monarchy survives on hierarchy, but the foundation survives on something different. Rules written precisely so that influence cannot belong to one individual forever. Charles now faced the contradiction at the center of the crisis. He was sovereign, yet sovereignty did not automatically make every independent institution his personal domain. Anne understood that distinction. More importantly, she understood what would happen if everyone around her pretended the distinction no longer mattered. Charles knew the council could no longer be treated as a formality. Its authority existed to protect trustee legitimacy by forcing major appointments through collective scrutiny, rather than allowing them to become automatic extensions of royal preference. That mattered because a trustee could influence strategy, funding priorities, and the direction of major charitable work. The king still carried enormous moral influence, but here he had to persuade rather than command. For a man accustomed to carrying the final word inside family matters, that limitation cut sharply. William entered the discussion carefully. He understood that supporting Anne might look like siding against his father at the worst possible moment. The prince chose each word with care, telling Charles that the vote should happen precisely because Camilla deserved an appointment nobody could later dismiss as improperly obtained. If the council approved her openly, he argued, no critic could say the queen consort had entered the role only because the king forced the door open. Charles heard something harsher. He looked at his son and asked whether William truly believed his judgment had endangered the foundation. The future king did not answer quickly. He respected his father, but silence now carried its own risk. William finally said the danger was not Camilla. It was precedent, a past decision that could later be used to justify similar decisions. If one sovereign could bypass a council for someone he trusted, another could eventually do the same for someone far less suitable. Anne then delivered the warning Charles had not expected. Through documented messages exchanged among Foundation members, she had learned that at least 2 council members were already prepared to demand a formally recorded vote if Camilla's appointment appeared without consultation. The Princess Royal made the consequence clear. What looked like one family disagreement had been only hours away from becoming a much larger institutional revolt. William closed the Foundation file and slid it slowly toward his father. He told Charles that a unanimous vote would strengthen Camilla far more than an imposed appointment ever could. Charles stared at the folder. Nobody rushed him. Then the king finally spoke. Then there will be a vote. Camilla understood immediately what those words meant. The role she had been promised was no longer guaranteed. Now she would have to face the judgment she had never expected to face, and discover whether the institution truly wanted her there. Once Charles agreed to the council vote, the atmosphere changed instantly. What had been presented to Camilla as an appointment was now a judgment. Names would be called. Positions would be recorded. Silence would carry meaning. And for a woman whose place inside royal life had always been surrounded by scrutiny, the thought of sitting outside a room while others decided whether she belonged inside it struck deeper than Anne had expected. Camilla felt the shift almost immediately. The planned trusteeship announcement was removed from the immediate agenda, and council members were formally told that her nomination would now go through the normal voting process. A trusteeship, in simple terms, meant holding an official role in guiding and overseeing the foundation's work. Palace advisors began rewriting briefing papers, while foundation officials worked to separate one question from another. Was she suitable for the role, and had Charles tried to move too quickly? Camilla confronted him in private. She asked why he had promised her the position, before confirming that he actually had the authority to deliver it. Charles tried to answer, but the words came slowly. He had wanted to spare her another public test, another moment when her place inside royal life could be debated. The king believed he was protecting her. Instead, he had created the very humiliation he wanted to avoid. Charles found her later beside the unsigned appointment document. Camilla folded the paper once, pushed it toward him, and said quietly that she had never asked him to bend rules for her. He could not answer immediately. The silence hurt more than an argument, because both of them understood the truth. His loyalty had crossed into overreach. Camilla told him that an apology could not erase what happened in front of Anne and the senior advisors. She had entered that meeting, believing the role was settled. She left knowing her position would now be judged by people who had never expected to vote on it at all. Charles apologized again, but she did not let him turn the moment into another attempt to protect her. Camilla then received an unexpected detail through a documented internal briefing. Anne had contacted no council member. She had asked nobody to vote against the nomination. The Princess Royal had challenged the process, but she had not campaigned against the Queen Consort herself. That discovery changed everything. Camilla began to understand that Anne might never have been trying to defeat her. She had been trying to stop Charles from creating a precedent that could damage everyone later. Late that evening, Camilla sent a private request to Anne. No king, no advisors, no council papers. For the first time since the crisis began, the two women at its center were about to speak, without Charles standing between them, and what Camilla said next would change the direction of the entire dispute. No secretaries took notes. No advisors waited beside the table. Charles was not invited. When Camilla entered the small private sitting room where Anne was waiting, the tension between them had nowhere to hide behind protocol. For years they had mastered the royal art of controlled expressions and careful language. This time, neither woman wanted ceremony. Camilla asked one question immediately. If Anne did not oppose her personally, why had she stopped Charles so publicly? Anne answered without hesitation. She said the meeting had been the last moment, when the appointment could still be halted quietly. Once Charles formally announced the trusteeship, reversing it would have created something far worse. A public humiliation attached directly to Camilla's name. A trusteeship, meaning an official role, helping guide and oversee the foundation, carried influence and responsibility. The Princess Royal believed that influence had to come through collective approval, not through a shortcut created by royal preference. Camilla listened, but the hurt did not disappear. She admitted that she had felt singled out from the moment Anne spoke. The Queen Consort had spent years trying to prove that her place inside royal life was legitimate, and the confrontation reopened every old wound. She had wondered whether the Princess Royal saw her as someone who could never truly earn acceptance, no matter how many duties she carried out. Anne let the words settle before answering. She told Camilla that allowing an improper appointment would have damaged her far more than stopping it. Every decision she later made inside the foundation could have been dismissed as the product of favoritism. Every success could have carried an asterisk. Anne had not wanted to weaken her. She had wanted to make sure nobody else could. Camilla then disclosed something Anne had not expected during that private conversation. She had never asked Charles to appoint her without a vote. She believed the procedure had already been completed when the king told her the position was settled. The Queen had walked into the meeting expecting confirmation, not controversy. Anne suddenly understood the deeper truth. Both women had been placed on opposite sides of a fight largely created by Charles's determination to protect Camilla from another painful test of acceptance. His instinct had been loving. Its consequence had been dangerous. Camilla stood to leave, then stopped. She extended her hand toward Anne. The Princess Royal looked at it before taking it. "Whatever happens," Anne said quietly, "it must belong to you, not to Charles's authority." Camilla agreed, and then she made her decision. She would personally tell Charles to stay away from any attempt to influence the council. The battle had changed completely. Camilla was now preparing to defend the very vote that had once felt like an insult. By morning, what had begun behind palace doors was no longer private. The withdrawn appointment appeared across broadcasts and newspaper pages as a rare glimpse of royal power meeting institutional resistance. Yet one image captured the public mood more powerfully than any headline. Anne arriving for an engagement with her expression composed, while reporters shouted questions about whether she had blocked the king. She did not answer. She did not need to. The story had already escaped. Charles watched the coverage with growing frustration. Commentators framed the dispute as an extraordinary clash between the monarch and his own sister, while others argued that the confrontation proved royal-linked institutions could not simply be reshaped through personal preference. The Foundation's governing council, the group responsible for formally approving major decisions, had become the center of national attention. What made the crisis damaging was simple. Charles had tried to protect Camilla from scrutiny, but his intervention had exposed her to far more of it. Camilla refused to let the anger turn against Anne. When Charles complained that his sister had allowed a private disagreement to become public humiliation, the Queen stopped him. She said defending her now did not mean attacking the person who demanded the vote. It meant respecting the process. The king looked at her differently after that. Only days earlier, she had felt betrayed by the Princess Royal. Now she was repeating Anne's argument back to him. Charles switched off the television after one broadcaster described Anne as the woman who had stopped the king. Camilla reached for the remote and turned it back on. She told him not to hide from what had happened. The monarch had wanted to shield her from judgment, but she no longer wanted protection that came at the cost of legitimacy. Then the broadcast delivered the detail everyone had been waiting for. Through a formal Foundation statement read during the morning coverage, the presenter confirmed that Camilla's nomination remained on the agenda for the upcoming council meeting. Anne had not removed her candidacy. She had only forced it through the proper route. Outside Buckingham Palace, the story took on a life of its own. A small crowd gathered behind press barriers as newspapers were held up for cameras. One front page carried the words that captured the entire confrontation. Anne forces the vote. Some saw rebellion, others saw accountability. Either way, nobody could pretend the dispute was merely a family quarrel anymore. Camilla waited elsewhere as council members began taking their seats. Charles could no longer promise her the outcome. Anne could no longer control it either. The headlines could argue about winners and losers. The council now held the only verdict that mattered, and whatever it decided would redefine Charles, Camilla, and Anne forever. When the council doors finally opened, there was no triumphal announcement and no dramatic celebration. There was something more important: certainty. Camilla's nomination had been considered properly, debated without royal instruction, and decided through the process Anne had refused to sacrifice. The crisis that threatened to divide a family ended not with one person defeating another, but with every person being forced to confront a hard truth. Legitimacy cannot be gifted by affection. It must survive scrutiny. Camilla received the decision quietly. The council had approved her trusteeship through a formal vote, meaning the governing group responsible for the foundation had collectively accepted her into the role. That mattered because the position could no longer be dismissed as something Charles had simply handed to his wife. The foundation released the result as a governance decision, not a royal victory, making clear that the procedure itself had survived the controversy. Camilla sought out Anne afterward. She admitted that the vote meant more to her than the original appointment ever could have. The Queen Consort had entered the crisis believing the blocked announcement was a humiliation. Now she understood that the delay had given her something Charles could never have guaranteed through authority alone: independent legitimacy. Anne listened without triumph. The Princess Royal had never wanted her defeated. She had wanted the decision to be strong enough to survive suspicion. Charles faced his own reckoning. In a private conversation with Anne, the king acknowledged that his desire to protect Camilla had almost weakened the very standing he hoped to strengthen. He had tried to remove uncertainty for his wife, but in doing so, he had created doubt around her appointment. His apology to his sister was brief and difficult. Anne accepted it just as quietly. Charles then made one final commitment. Future foundation nominations involving senior royals would follow documented council procedure before any palace announcement was prepared. The monarch had learned that protecting an institution sometimes meant accepting limits rather than testing how far his authority could reach. Charles picked up the same pen he had set down when Anne first stopped him. This time, he did not use it to appoint Camilla. He signed the council's formally approved record. The king understood the difference. Anne watched in silence. Camilla stood beside him, no longer as the beneficiary of a shortcut, but as the trustee the council itself had chosen. What began as Anne stopping her brother ended with something far more consequential. Charles surrendered the shortcut, Camilla gained legitimacy through scrutiny, and the monarchy proved that loyalty to the crown can sometimes require telling the king no. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.